In early 1916, Europe was already drowning in blood. The First World War had killed millions, yet the Western Front remained frozen in a deadly stalemate. Endless trenches stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border, where soldiers lived and died in mud, cold, and fear, and every major offensive had failed to bring victory. From this deadlock, the German High Command devised a chilling plan. This was not a battle to seize land or end the war quickly, but one designed to destroy France through exhaustion. The goal was brutally simple: force the French army to defend a place it could never abandon and bleed it until it collapsed. That place was Verdun. More than a fortress, Verdun was a symbol of French pride and national identity. To lose it would be unthinkable, and the Germans knew it. When the attack began, Verdun was turned into a landscape of constant fire, where forests vanished, villages disappeared, and survival depended on chance. For 10 relentless months, Verdun became a machine of destruction. More than 700,000 men were killed, wounded, or went missing. Victory was no longer measured in ground gained, but in how much blood a nation could lose and still stand. This is the story of Verdun, the battle meant to bleed France dry. Let's begin. By the end of 1915, the First World War had reached a grim standstill. The early dreams of quick victories had evaporated, replaced by an unending war of attrition. On the Western Front, opposing armies faced each other across a labyrinth of trenches protected by barbed wire, machine guns, and artillery. Every attempt to break this deadlock had resulted in catastrophic losses for minimal gains. The battles of Ypres, the Somme early planning stages, and countless smaller offensives had proven one brutal truth: modern industrial warfare favored defense, not attack. Germany, fighting a war on two fronts, understood that time was not on its side. While its armies held strong positions in the West, the British Empire's resources and the French army's manpower seemed endless. To the east, Russia remained a dangerous threat, despite its internal weaknesses. German leaders believed that a decisive moment was needed before their enemies' superior numbers and industry could overwhelm them. At the center of German planning stood General Erich von Falkenhayn, the chief of the German General Staff. Falkenhayn had reached a controversial conclusion. He believed that Germany did not need to conquer large swaths of territory to win the war. Instead, victory could be achieved by destroying the enemy's will and ability to fight. France, in his view, was the weakest link among Germany's major opponents. If the French army could be broken, Britain would be left isolated on the continent, and the war could be brought to a favorable conclusion. Falkenhayn's solution was radical and chilling. Rather than launching a broad offensive, he proposed concentrating overwhelming force on a single point the French could not afford to lose. The French army, bound by honor and national pride, would be forced to defend it at all costs. There, Germany would unleash its superior artillery and firepower, inflicting casualties on a scale that France could not sustain. This was not a battle for conquest. It was a battle of deliberate exhaustion. The chosen battlefield was Verdun, sat along the Meuse River in northeastern France, surrounded by a ring of forts constructed after France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. These fortifications were designed to protect the eastern approaches to Paris and had long been considered nearly impregnable. More importantly, Verdun held immense symbolic value. It had resisted foreign invasions for centuries and stood as a monument to French determination. To abandon Verdun without a fight would be a national humiliation. Ironically, by 1916, Verdun's defenses were weaker than they appeared. French military doctrine had shifted before the war, emphasizing offensive action over static defense. As a result, many of Verdun's forts had been stripped of heavy guns and garrisons to support other sectors of the front. The French High Command believed a major German attack there was unlikely. Verdun lay in a salient, difficult for the Germans to supply and surrounded on three sides by French territory. In theory, it was a poor target for a large offensive. Falkenhayn saw this vulnerability as an opportunity. German preparations for the attack were immense and meticulously planned. More than 1,200 artillery pieces were assembled, including some of the largest guns ever built. Railways were expanded, supply depots constructed, and troops quietly positioned. The plan relied heavily on artillery dominance. German guns would pulverize French positions before infantry advanced, ensuring maximum casualties with minimal German losses. On February 21, 1916, the storm broke. At 7:15 in the morning, the German artillery opened fire on the French lines around Verdun. What followed was unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. 4 hours, shells rained down continuously, tearing apart trenches, obliterating communication lines, and burying soldiers alive. Entire hillsides were reshaped in minutes. The sky darkened with smoke and debris, and the ground shook as if struck by an earthquake. French soldiers who survived the initial bombardment emerged into a landscape that no longer resembled the world they knew. Landmarks were gone. Roads had vanished. The air was thick with dust, gas, and the screams of the wounded. German infantry advanced behind the artillery, moving cautiously through the devastation, encountering stunned and disorganized defenders. Within days, the Germans achieved a stunning success. Fort Douaumont, the largest and most important fortress in the Verdun system, fell into German hands. With barely a fight, a small German unit entered the fort almost by accident, finding it largely unmanned. The loss of Douaumont sent shockwaves through France. A symbol of national defense had collapsed, seemingly confirming German expectations that Verdun would fall quickly. But the French response was swift and desperate. General Philippe Pétain was appointed to command the defense of Verdun. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Pétain understood the true nature of the battle unfolding. He recognized that Verdun was not about maneuver or rapid victory, but about survival under constant fire. His priority was not dramatic counterattacks, but maintaining the flow of men and supplies to the front. Pétain reorganized the French defense around a single lifeline, Teboya Sacré, or Sacred Way. This narrow road became the artery through which Verdun lived or died. Day and night, trucks carried troops, ammunition, food, and medical supplies toward the front, while wounded soldiers were evacuated in the opposite direction. If the road failed, Verdun would fall. At the same time, Pétain instituted a rotation system that would become legendary. Instead of leaving units to be destroyed at the front, divisions were regularly rotated in and out of the Verdun sector. Over time, nearly 3/4 of the entire French army would serve at Verdun. The battle became a shared national ordeal, binding France together through collective sacrifice. As winter turned to spring, the fighting intensified. German attacks continued relentlessly, pushing closer to the city while French artillery and counterattacks fought to contain them. The battlefield narrowed, but the destruction deepened. Men fought for control of shattered forts, ruined villages, and nameless ridges that changed hands repeatedly at staggering cost. Verdun was no longer just a military engagement. It had become a test of endurance, morale, and identity. For the Germans, it was the execution of a cold, calculated strategy. For the French, it was a fight for survival and honor. Both sides were being drawn deeper into a battle that neither could easily escape. And as the months passed, it became clear that Verdun was not bleeding France alone. Germany, too, was being slowly drained by the very machine it had created. The battle had only just begun. By the spring of 1916, Verdun had become a place where time seemed to lose all meaning. Days and nights blended together beneath constant shell fire, and the rhythm of life was dictated by explosions rather than clocks. The German offensive, expected to break French resistance within weeks, instead dragged on, sinking both armies deeper into a battle of pure attrition. Every hill, every ruined fort, and every fragment of ground was paid for in blood. As the fighting intensified, artillery dominated the battlefield. Never before had such a concentration of firepower been unleashed in one place for so long. Shells fell so frequently that soldiers described the earth as boiling. Trenches collapsed, men were buried alive, and the wounded often lay helpless for hours or days, unable to move under continuous bombardment. The sound of the guns became constant, a deafening roar that shattered nerves and sanity. Infantry assaults followed a grim and predictable pattern. After days of shelling, German troops advanced across devastated ground, moving through clouds of smoke and debris. French defenders, exhausted but determined, emerged from shattered trenches and underground shelters to meet them with rifle fire and machine guns. Attacks gained a few hundred meters, sometimes less, only to be halted by counterattacks or fresh artillery barrages. The front lines shifted back and forth, often ending the day almost exactly where they had begun. One of the most fiercely contested areas was the ridge of Le Morton, known as Dead Man's Hill, and the nearby height of Cape 304. These positions overlooked critical approaches to Verdun and became the focus of relentless German assaults. For weeks, artillery fire reduced the hills to barren mounds of churned earth. Trees were splintered into matchsticks, and the soil became so saturated with metal that it could no longer absorb rain. Control of these heights changed hands repeatedly, each exchange costing thousands of lives. Inside the forts, conditions were scarcely better. Fort Vaux, located near the fallen Fort Douaumont, became the scene of one of the battle's most harrowing episodes. In June 1916, German forces surrounded the fort and began a brutal siege. French defenders fought from dark corridors and underground chambers, using rifles, grenades, and even bare hands. As ammunition ran low, water became scarce, and wounded men lay in suffocating heat and darkness. After days of resistance, the garrison finally surrendered, not from lack of courage, but from sheer physical collapse. The fall of Fort Vaux was a significant German victory, but it came at an enormous cost. Every advance was met with fierce resistance, and French artillery continued to inflict devastating losses. Pétain's rotation system ensured that while individual units were shattered, the French army as a whole remained intact. Fresh divisions replaced exhausted ones, carrying with them stories of the horror they were about to face. Verdun became a rite of passage, a place where soldiers were tested to the limits of endurance. Morale on both sides began to erode. For French soldiers, Verdun was hell, but it was a hell that could not be abandoned. The phrase "they shall not pass" became a rallying cry, repeated in letters, newspapers, and speeches. It was less a statement of confidence than a declaration of necessity. There was no alternative but to endure. German troops, however, faced a growing sense of disillusionment. The promise of a decisive victory faded as casualties mounted and progress slowed. The very strategy designed to minimize German losses was failing. Artillery superiority could not break French resolve, and each gain required new sacrifices. The battlefield consumed men at a rate that no plan had fully anticipated. As summer approached, the wider war began to intrude on Verdun. In July 1916, the British launched the Battle of the Somme, forcing Germany to divert men and artillery away from Verdun. The strain on German resources increased, and the momentum of the offensive began to falter. What had been intended as a controlled operation turned into an open wound that refused to close. Meanwhile, the human costs continued to rise. Medical services struggled to cope with the sheer number of wounded. Field hospitals overflowed, and evacuation routes were constantly threatened by shellfire. Surgeons worked without rest, performing amputations and life-saving procedures under impossible conditions. Many men survived only to be permanently scarred, physically and mentally, by what they had endured. The landscape itself became a weapon. Rain turned shell holes into muddy graves, and the stench of decay hung over the battlefield. Corpses lay unburied, sometimes for weeks, as fighting made retrieval impossible. Soldiers learned to live among the dead, stepping over bodies and using shattered remains as cover. Verdun was no longer a place of human order. It was an environment shaped entirely by destruction. Bilate-sur-Mer, the German offensive, had lost its original purpose. France had not collapsed. Instead, both armies were trapped in a cycle of attack and counterattack, driven by obligation rather than strategy. Verdun had become a symbol not just of French endurance, but of the futility of industrial warfare itself. Yet the battle was far from over. As autumn approached, the balance began to shift. The French army, battered but unbroken, prepared to reclaim what it had lost. Verdun, once chosen to bleed France dry, was about to turn into something else entirely, a test of whether endurance alone could be transformed into victory. By the autumn of 1916, Verdun had ceased to be a battle of ambition and had become a struggle of survival. The original German plan to exhaust France had failed to deliver a decisive result, and the enormous losses suffered by both sides forced a shift in strategy. For the French, the time had come not merely to endure, but to strike back. What followed was a slow, methodical effort to reclaim the ground that had been lost months earlier, and to prove that Verdun would not remain a symbol of suffering alone. French command now rested under General Robert Nivelle, who replaced Pétain in directing offensive operations around Verdun. Nivelle believed that carefully coordinated artillery barrages, followed by well-timed infantry advances, could break German defenses. Unlike the early months of the battle, these counter-offensives were planned with precision rather than desperation. Artillery fire was mapped and measured, and infantry were trained to move forward in its protective shadow. In October 1916, the French launched their first major Thousands of guns opened fire, unleashing a devastating bombardment on German positions that had once been French. The ground shook once more, but this time the destruction served a clear purpose. When the infantry advanced, they found German defenses weakened, communication lines shattered, and morale dangerously low. Fort Douaumont, whose loss had stunned France earlier in the year, was recaptured after intense fighting. Days later, Fort Vaux also returned to French control. These victories carried enormous symbolic weight. The forts themselves had limited strategic value by this stage of the war, but their recovery restored a sense of national pride. Verdun, once on the brink of collapse, was now firmly back in French hands. For soldiers and civilians alike, it was proof that endurance had meaning, and that sacrifice had not been in vain. The fighting continued into December, though on a reduced scale. Both armies were exhausted beyond measure. Units were shadows of their former strength, and replacements often arrived with minimal training. The winter cold added a new layer of suffering, freezing mud into jagged terrain and making movement even more difficult. Yet compared to the inferno of the previous months, the intensity slowly diminished. When the battle officially ended in mid-December 1916, the front lines stood remarkably close to where they had been at the beginning. After 10 months of relentless combat, neither side had achieved a decisive territorial breakthrough. What remained were the consequences. Approximately 300,000 dead, and more than 400,000 wounded or missing. Verdun had consumed human lives on a scale that defied comprehension. For France, Verdun became a defining national myth. It represented resistance against overwhelming odds and the refusal to surrender, regardless of cost. Survivors of Verdun were revered, their service viewed as the ultimate expression of duty. The battle shaped French military thinking for decades, reinforcing the belief in defensive strength and national endurance. For Germany, Verdun was a strategic and moral failure. The attempt to win the war through attrition had backfired, draining German manpower without breaking French resolve. Falkenhayn was dismissed from his position, and the German command shifted its focus elsewhere. Verdun became a cautionary tale, illustrating the limits of calculated cruelty and the unpredictable resilience of an enemy fighting for survival. Beyond military outcomes, Verdun left a deep psychological legacy. Many soldiers returned home profoundly changed, carrying memories of constant shell fire, buried comrades, and unrelenting fear. The term shell shock entered public consciousness, reflecting the invisible wounds inflicted by industrial warfare. Verdun demonstrated that modern war could destroy not only bodies, but minds. The landscape itself bore permanent scars. Even today, large areas around Verdun remain marked by craters, unexploded shells, and poisoned soil. Forests that regrew over the battlefield conceal the remnants of trenches, bunkers, and human remains. The ground remembers what happened there, long after the guns fell silent. Verdun also reshaped the way the world understood war. It exposed the brutal logic of attrition, where victory is pursued not through maneuver or brilliance, but through the systematic destruction of human life. The battle showed that such a strategy could entrap both attacker and defender in an endless cycle of loss, with no guarantee of success. In the broader context of the First World War, Verdun did not decide the conflict, but it defined it. It encapsulated the war as central tragedy, immense sacrifice in pursuit of objectives that gradually lost their meaning. The battle stood as a warning of what happens when industrial power is unleashed without restraint, guided by theories that reduce human beings to numbers on a casualty list. Today, Verdun stands as a place of memory. Cemeteries, memorials, and ossuaries hold the remains of thousands who never left the battlefield. Visitors walk through quiet forests and peaceful fields, often unaware that beneath their feet lies one of the most violent chapters in human history. Verdun reminds us that the cost of war extends far beyond victory or defeat. It was meant to bleed France dry. Instead, it revealed the true price of modern warfare, a price paid in lives, in suffering, and in lessons written in blood.